So, hi everyone, I'm here with Luke Sculthorp today. And Luke, you're the commercial director for the UK and Ireland for My DSO Manager not in the arrears management, but in the receivables management, the whole sort of receivables management really, and largely in the B2B space as well. So thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Chris. Pleasure to join you.
So we were just chatting there about, I suppose, some of the challenges that there are in the world at the moment in terms of, we've had geopolitical risks, we've got economic risks that are kind of going on at the moment. I'm kind of interested, in your role, really, in terms of like you've been out there sort of doing this role for a while now. In terms of like, what are some of the themes that you're kind of seeing with customers and I suppose particularly in the commercial kind of space as well?
Yeah, so what we're seeing sort of with the economy from our customer base, there's definitely pressure on cash. We certainly see that, Chris, rather than panic. Okay, so most of our customers doing well. Okay, they're certainly looking to grow. So growth is a key objective, and trying to protect margin is a key one as well. But they are working harder for their cash, and their overdue debt picture we see as it's becoming more complex. So across these customer portfolios, I mentioned the pressure. It's rarely showing up as one single issue, and it's not necessarily customers paying late. That isn't necessarily what we're seeing all the time. More often, it's a mixture of stretched terms, customers asking for payment terms to be extended. We're looking also at significant delays on approvals. Deductions from an invoicing perspective, they seem to be on the increase, and not just in fast-moving consumer goods, which is where it's prevalent. We're also seeing proof of delivery issues. So when we talk about geopolitical issues, we talk about conflict in the Middle East, that's certainly on the rise. When we think about exporters, we get a lot of those. We have a lot of those sort of customers. Claims, so from a dispute perspective, on the increase, and pricing challenges, but also customers protecting their own liquidity more tightly. So we talk about that holding on to money, that tactic. We talk about, certainly preserving working capital. That's still there, but that is looking tighter. So they're the sort of things that we see from an arrears perspective, more layered. So when we think about this, I suppose your aging report, so your aging balance, most credit teams look at that. Maybe sometimes they look at it firstly. It doesn't show the full picture. It's not giving you the full story. So we see quite often with our customers that payment behavior has worsened from their supply chain, and they think it's worsened sharply. But when they look at the book and when they break it down properly, part of the overdue balance is often tied up in those unresolved queries, those disputes, or it shows up as operational friction internally. So yeah, there's certainly some real deterioration, but part of the drag is actually sitting in process, not just in collections. So it's not just about your customers paying late.
And that's what characterizes for me, I suppose, that businesses feel like things are tighter now than they used to be. So let's tighten our process and let's stretch terms as an example. Let's dispute everything we can. Let's make sure that nothing's going through that shouldn't be there, those kind of things. So it's like, well, we need to run a tighter ship as a result of it. And so it feels like across the whole of the process, things seem to be tightening up. So firms are looking around, how do we run a tighter ship to sort of manage some of those like cash flow or working capital kind of issues.
Absolutely, yeah. And if we look across our customer base, I would say that the strongest pattern is that businesses want to become more precise. So they no longer want one overdue number. They want to understand what is collectible, and what's the collectability, what is disputed, and what is strategically slow. and what's an early sign of wider risk. So they're the three areas predominantly, and it's particularly important in your larger and more complex portfolios.
I mean, I suppose when you're sort of in this sort of tightening situation, we all do it, even if you just use as an analogy when you're at home, you sort of like tighten the belt somewhat and you're sort of looking like, how can I shave cost off here, there and everywhere? There becomes a point where you can't do any more, and then you sort of like, you run out of tightening that can be done. Do you think, and that's when you get into like real sort of like economic issues, I suppose, in terms of like things like the business becomes really stretched, or they get into real sort of like working cash flow kind of issues. How far do you think we're going to trend towards that? I mean, how do you think that will sort of like play out? I mean, at what point does it kind of stop and then we're into like, we need to do something structurally different?
Yeah, it's good talking point. I think we are in a position of, certainly with certain territories, certainly with certain sectors and products, we are certainly in that position where customers are asking for stretch terms, and it's whether you can get to a position of, are you happy with that? It's whether or not if you're credit insured, it's whether or not your utilization levels are underneath your threshold of acceptance. It's your risk appetite. Where's your risk appetite? Is it where it was 12 months ago? Transportation costs. So if you are in the export game, that's something that is really being affected now. When's it going to go down? We don't know. It's crystal ball, isn't it? Certainly, the conflict in the Middle East is worsening the situation. Is it ending? We don't necessarily want to be too political with this discussion, but maybe we need to sort of think about that, and then what's the next big geopolitical issue that's going to hit us all. So you're under attack all the time, aren't you? You're under attack all the time. You must get to that position of where you and your customer you're coming together. Certainly as much effort to get to a reasonable place anyway. But yeah, what do you do? You've got your delivery delays. You've got your delivery delays, but you've also got these orders that are coming in, and you have to fulfill them. It's a key client. What do you do? So it's very, very tricky. I don't think I necessarily have a definitive answer for you, or where when or when this when can we continue on in this sort of trading condition? Is it going to lessen? When's it going to lessen?
And I suppose it's just a reflection around. I mean, there are some big risks potentially out there. I'm not sure, are we talking about them enough in terms of like these shocks that can kind of come through? And then if you're sitting there as a credit manager, really, what do we need to do, and when do we then need to pull the trigger in terms of doing that? Either in terms of, relooking at credit terms, and to what point do you then sort of change your credit terms versus, I suppose, and then the back end in terms of collections, what can you do around that? Because we can sort of like, often it's easy just to sort of eke it out and just sort of like, get a little bit tighter on these things. But at some point, we need to have a playbook around, well, do we need to do something different or not? And when do we even recognize that? And I suppose part of that is having good business intelligence, good sort of like forecasting, keeping up with it, those kind of things. But it's like, do you think that's top of mind enough for people at the moment? Just given, I mean, there are some really big risks out there in terms of like, transportation costs, as an example, and inflation around transportation costs, which can really fundamentally affect businesses and sort of like prices for consumers, but also prices for, cost bases for firms. I mean, do you think people are thinking about that enough, or do you think we're okay where we're really just in this wait and see kind of mode?
Wait and see, but the good credit teams are the ones who are thinking about how do we get to a better position, and that's mainly driven by your CFO or your FD up the chain, what questions they're asking. So as long as you can cover all the bases, as long as you have an answer for what decision you're making, and you're doing that in an informed position, you've got the data, you are probably going to be in a position of overtrading, because you're so stretched. It's definitely a wait and see. definitely a wait and see at this moment in time for a lot of our customers. And we've probably not even really thought about how stretched you are as a team. Do you have enough heads? Is the credit team actually that buoyant at the moment? There's certainly a lot of people who are not in work in our profession. We do see that in a, not necessarily, not to be alarmist, but we do see that. We see pretty senior people that have not picked up their next assignment, not picked up their next appointment. Is there a wider sort of discussion around that as well? Are the actual teams stretched in terms of what work that they are having to cover and the targets they've got to meet?
There's a discussion there around how much can automation sort of take the load of that, but I suppose there's also going from what has the last sort of couple of decades has been a very sort of stable environment, which is sort of very predictable, and then you can sort of use that. If we go to a much more unstable environment like it was 20, 30 years ago, then do you need to have the expertise, or do you use automation to then be able to then leverage a resource more? I mean, those are kind of the things that seem like they're bubbling at the moment.
Yeah, we would always be on the side of automation and any kind of application of technology in our world. It has to enable empowerment. So it has to ensure that it's showing the operation where the gaps are, where the inefficiencies are. If we've got manual processes that can be automated, that are going to free up hours of resource to be more strategic, focusing on relationships. We mentioned before we started this recording, we mentioned the whole situation of trade credit, commercial, B2B. It's very much led, your success is very much led on how effective you are with your stakeholder relationships. That can be customer, that can be internal customer, external, internal. The tech has to do some heavy lifting where it can. So the automation of very manual tasks like sending copy invoices to customers, well, that should really be automated, but it should also serve as something that the customer can interact with, so they can have a self-service function. So there's certain teams that we've seen that take hours and hours on these type of queries. So you lessen that, and that is not really much of a value add when you look at it from an output perspective. So all of those sort of manual tasks, yes, certainly let's automate. From a risk perspective, let's have a risk agenda that talks to the collections strategy. So the segmentation of your customer can be appropriated to how we actually treat them. And let's automate certain manual tasks within that strategy, so that the communication of emails, let's automate that. Let's have it semi-automated, so we do have at least oversight from a human, that the credit controller, the collector, the credit manager, they do have that oversight and that sanitizing, should we say, and we have that quality checkpoint. But certainly, if we can ensure that those communications can be pushed out, they're followed in a pathway of treatment, a strategy, but they don't necessarily need to have somebody composing them, sending them out manually. It's all of that really, plus being able to assign invoices, assign customers to a resource when resources are not available. Resource not available. What are we actually doing with those customers when our team are not here? They're on holiday. They're wherever else. They've been deployed somewhere else in the business. So yeah, it's all of that. It's sometimes overlooked. The basics are sometimes overlooked, and we don't want technology to come in and overcomplicate anything. We want it to be as as effective as it can be to enable and empower that credit team to be as effective as it can be.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot talked about AI. I know we're going to talk a bit about AI, and I know you guys have done a lot on it and sort of put a lot of automation kind of in as well. But it also seems like we've almost like reached the peak of the hype cycle. And really what you're explaining there was like, how do we use this almost like, just like we use all other technology to then just automate some of the stuff that we do anyway, right? Do you think the sort of like the heat's gone out of it to a certain extent, but now we're actually getting to, this is how we can actually make people's jobs easier? I mean, that feels like that's where we are in terms of AI. I mean, is that how you guys are kind of seeing it?
We see it like that, yeah. Moreover, as an immediate observation, we would never see it as replacing. So we'd never see credit judgment. So your risk analyst, your analyst that has to look at and create a paper that has to go into all of your organic detail, payment behavior of your customer, and then all the other external data points from the bureaus or from your credit insurer, wherever else you're looking. Lots of different indexes, lots of geopolitical information that we can have now fed in. I don't think from a judgment perspective can be essentially replaced, or even when you think about the old-fashioned ways of doing it, which still exist, client visits. You visit a client, you try and understand what's going on. There could be an issue. That's probably why you're visiting them in the first instance. But seeing the warehouse, seeing the people there, having a conversation with them, widening out your awareness, talking to other such people in the business that might have been there previously, understanding what might have changed. Looking at stock levels. What's actually going on. We can be very much focused in on, we can do our job from our desk. Yeah, you can, but seeing an operation with your own eyes, that gives us a lot of opportunity for understanding what our next steps can be and supporting that. We're big advocates in terms of sharing intelligence, and bigger advocates certainly in the UK market of certain instruments like credit circles. So very prevalent in trade credit, and certainly focused in on commonality of customer. So credit managers can have a forum where they have a common interest, so they're sector centric ordinarily, and they will share information, not as a cartel. They won't talk about changes in credit limits. They will talk about fraud as well. We haven't really touched on fraud, but certainly that's prevalent. But certainly new account opening inquiries that have been deemed as, should we say, not legitimate, identity fraud attempts potentially, they can be shared with a common interest to peers, and that's helping protect. But also, talking about certain personnel within certain businesses that we're all transacting with around a table. Personnel have moved on, so what can we support each other with? That we very much advocate that type of sharing of intelligence. Obviously, not, as I mentioned, not to go over the line in terms of creating, as I said, sort of cartels, that sort of conditioning. But we see those type of instruments, those type of forums as invaluable, and will become more so if we are in this position of where trading is being stretched.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that certainly the technology around doing things like, I mean, I just think like, you know, matching invoices or matching orders when you talk about things like invoice fraud or matching back to original items and being able to do that in way more detail than could ever be done before. Technology allows us to do that in many new different ways that maybe allows us to then sort of, say, get tighter in terms of our processes. I mean, I'm always a big advocate of going visit customers because there's nothing short of actually sort of touching the stock, is there? I mean, it's actually touching the stock, actually visiting people, making sure they've got a real office or those kind of things. And you sort of, I just wonder how much we're in danger of some of that when we've gone all virtual, particularly since the pandemic over the last 5-6 years. I mean, that must be an exposure for us, and we kind of got to get back into sort of getting out there to a certain extent, and maybe technology frees us up to allow the resource to be able to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. So touching the stock, the dust on it. How long has it been there? What's happening? Are they actually fulfilling their orders? Yeah, it's a little bit of a worry. It's also not. As time goes on, we're going to lose some of these old heads. We're going to lose these wise men and women from the industry. Are we replacing? So we did touch on people, we touched on resource. Can we use technology to bridge some of the skill shortages? Hayes International and a number of the other resources and significant recruitment businesses out there, who are very much dedicated to the credits management industry, they do talk about a very apparent skills gap. Now that could be because of a number of different issues. We still offshore. So have we, through that, depleted a bit of a pipeline of talent that naturally would have built up, but because those sort of entry jobs aren't there to get people into certain businesses and to meet the credit profession, is that changing because of the offshoring? I know businesses have come back. I know it's a constant conversation around UK jobs and let's preserve, and is it actually in the long term, is it actually the best strategic route when you think about outsourcing? But certainly technology might well be able to bridge that gap. And we see ourselves really as an educator. We see ourselves as a business that can support process engineering. Our system is optimized, so those collection strategies, the risk agenda, and all that's optimized. We've been able to optimize that over the 10 years of being in existence. So you also buy that when you buy us. So your credits manager might not be the most experienced person, but they might have tech, not necessarily our tech, whatever it may be, but they may have tech that's already optimized. It will have tutorials in it. So for use, they will have a support team as well within that tech business. And so therefore, potentially, tech does actually, again, further enable and further empower those credit professionals to be best in class. So that's something else that potentially needs a focus, a key focus.
I mean, one of the things that always kind of struck me, and we were chatting about it just before we started, was the linkage between the arrears process and the credit process, and really sort of looking across the whole of the process. I mean, how important do you think that's going to become in terms of being able to link it back to orders, back to the credit cycle, or the credit granting process, or the credit management process, back to the arrears process, and then the disputes back to the product piece? I mean, that because there is that customer life cycle, and we do have that concept in consumer lending, but it feels like, I mean, it's equally as important on the commercial side as well. I mean, how important do you sort of see that, and how do we get people to kind of understand that and get the information flowing across, end to end, so you got that feedback loop?
We need to have an awareness of the end-to-end process of credits management, and we need to think about from a base level. We need to think about how do we treat that customer if we're not segmenting and we're just applying a blanket approach, so for collections, we're not necessarily thinking about risk appetite or profile, propensity to pay. We're just simply applying a very standard linear pathway collection strategy. If we're able to segment that portfolio of customer at a base level to say, okay, well, we understand from these indicators, from our bureau partner, from our credit insurance partner, from also making sure that we can have a payment profile across our full portfolio, how we then can categorize and segment those customers, and therefore we can apply a certain very much bespoke collection strategy to that group of customer. We then can build out a lot of reporting and analytics around how successful that collection strategy is. How effective was it for that 6 months? And that then can drive into how we review. Do we keep that strategy? Do we add certain stages in? Do we take stages out? And enable the customer to do all of that. So they have the optimized starting point, but that optimized starting point can change because of their customers are unique to them. So it's bringing the risk and the collections together. The dispute piece does get ignored, and that's another highly just as important element as risk and collections. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not able to identify where your disputes sit, you're never going to be able to improve, and you're never going to be able to really carry out some kind of risk, some kind of root cause analysis that will enable you to really shift that dispute position. I think PwC talk about a global issue around disputes, and it's in the trillions of US dollars. It's a US survey, but certainly globally. But they talk about the fact that that's significantly hindering working capital. That's the biggest issue in working capital deterioration in terms of unresolved queries that are sitting in dispute. So if you have a real focus on those three key elements and you have it all synced, then you're going to be able to answer certainly those big questions from the finance leads, from your CFO or your FD, and you are going to be able to, with a clear conscience, create improvement, get that DSO moving down, getting the aged balance reducing in those pockets that are troublesome.
I mean, it does seem like data is kind of a key element to that in terms of making sure you have data that goes across the life cycle. You can track what's happened to a customer as they've gone through, if they go into the arrears process, if they don't, what the dispute is, and like linking all that back to the credit process or the credit management process from the arrears process just allows you to have that holistic view. Could be quite powerful, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've not really talked about unbilled, or we would call it WIP, so work in progress. You're understanding your position, so you know that readily as the credit team, but you maybe not, shall we say, really, really close to the commercial team. So the commercial team have all these orders. You'll understand through your billing patterns, if it's seasonal, you'll understand what's really going to come down the track, but it can vary. So understanding full exposure is another thing. So when we talk about risk, we also can't just think about, well, what do we have? Oh, right, okay, yes, we just have, yeah, absolutely, yes. So we need to think about all that unbilled, the orders coming, the pipeline coming in. So, your CRM system is something that the sales team will use. for orders, for all that. Okay, we're probably not going to get access to that because we're the credit team. We don't really want access to it. We want to use our systems. And likewise, sales, commercial team, they'll want to use their system. But certainly technology now, and this is something that we've developed, you can link your CRM system. So you have a consolidated risk report that isn't just your AR position. It also has all of your backlog, your WIP, whatever we want to call it. And you can have that information go back into the CRM for the sales team. So the sales team will have a reluctance to use a finance system and vice versa. So you're able to share the information. You also to share information in terms of payment behavior back to the credit insurer, the trade credit insurer as well. So it's not just information going in. You want information to also go back to an external partner or to an internal stakeholder that's very much important to the whole order to cash processes. So we're the credit team. We are certainly the owner, but we have to depend on information coming to us from all of these other internal stakeholders. So you know the ability to empower is and I think I've mentioned a number of times, don't want to keep repeating myself, but the ability to empower is the strongest position to be in from a tech perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting space, the whole commercial credit kind of space. I mean, sort of like if we look out the next sort of like 3-5 years, I mean, having a crystal ball is difficult always, but I mean, what are some of the things you think we've got to watch out for? What are the highlights of the areas where you think people have got to pay attention and focus, do you think, or what are we expecting to kind of see? What would you watch out for?
I think I would be, if I was operational credit person now, I would be I'd be a little bit cynical about certain tech that promises the world, okay, that will justify buying early, so early justification. Buy this technology because it will give you an immediate return on investment because it's going to reduce hours, okay, or you know, you can therefore reduce headcount. Okay, I would be very reluctant to really push on with that kind of purchase. I think there's technology out there that can very much create an efficiency gap, lessening, closing, and that's great. But to try and justify reducing headcount, reducing that human capital cost, I think is for me it's not the way I'd want. It's not the way I'd want technology to be represented in the credit industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think data seems like that's kind of key, and sort of getting your processes running as smoothly as possible, making sure you retain the experience kind of things. Seems like those are kind of areas which, I mean, those are kind of like everlasting. They're evergreen kind of areas which we kind of look at, right? Which is like, how do we kind of evolve? And I think your sense around just a little bit of caution is often quite a good thing, right? So in terms of just making sure that, you know, because you don't want to be financially exposed with something that goes wrong as well. So I mean, Luke, thanks very much for making the time. As I said, I mean, I think it's a very interesting area. I think often it's we often don't touch on it enough in terms of like the whole commercial credit kind of life cycle. So I really appreciate making the time and sort of giving a bit of an insight, really, I suppose, and certainly a teaching moment for me in terms of like how to manage some of this stuff and some of the complexities around it. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. And we didn't even talk about e-invoice mandating, which is a key one, and new late payment legislation. So we can talk about that, but we can talk about that from a technology framing perspective. And you might want to have me along again, so we could focus in on that, because they're certainly areas that are being talked about. UK markets, we're not having to adopt e-invoice mandating just as yet, but it will be a cost. It will be a further investment for businesses. So there's an impact there. Italy, Belgium over on the continent, and France have adopted. So it'd be a good one to look out for in terms of how that's impacting commerce.
Well, I mean, certainly I know the EU's been putting in legislation around like harmonizing invoicing, harmonizing terms, those kind of things. And yeah, although that doesn't necessarily directly affect the UK at the moment, as being in the UK, some of those ideas do become common, right? So it'd be similar legislation or, copy legislation, those kind of things. So I think it's well worth sort of raising and having on people's radar screens. So, well, Luke, thanks very much. I appreciate it. And we'll no doubt chat soon as well.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me.